You are ugly, stupid, weak, incompetent, and on top of it, selfish. You failed to get this funding, therefore, your idea sucks. Therefore, you're a failure. It's not going to work out anyway, so what's the point in trying? Does this sound familiar? This is the product of your inner critic who is spewing all these toxic narratives in an attempt to guard you from the external pain by causing you more pain. We are so afraid of being rejected that our inner critic rejects ourselves first to avoid the pain of dealing with rejection. If you are coexisting with this toxic entity, this is your sign to stop and to reverse the narrative. Welcome to the Mindset for Peak Performance series of Soulful Entrepreneur podcast. In today's episode, I will introduce you to your inner critic, help you catch and disarm him, and free yourself from the bondage that hinders you from succeeding at building your startup, a project you've always wanted to build, and create from a place of security and love. I've summarized the insights from a book that is helping me overcome my inner critic called Self-Esteem by Matthew McKay and Patrick Faining. I highly recommend reading this book if you find this content useful. But this episode is just the start of your journey to a healthy relationship with yourself. First things first, let's try to define this inner voice. Pathological critic is a term defined by Eugene Sagan to describe the negative inner voice that attacks and judges you. Everyone has a negative self voice. However, people with lower self-esteem tend to have more vicious and vocal pathological critic. This critic blames you for things that go wrong, compares you to others, their achievements and abilities, and finds you wanting more. This pathological critic sets impossible standards for achievements and perfections and beats you up for smallest mistake. It reminds you of past failures, but never of achievements. This carping inner voice seems natural, familiar part of you. Here's the catch. He's almost always believed. So how was this inner critic born? The inner critic feeds off of early, not okay feelings and experiences. This is the voice of a disapproving parent, for example. Growing up, we all experience punishing events and personal theorist Sullivan calls forbidding gestures that could have manifested as anger or withdrawal on behalf of your parents. The strength of the inner critic depends on a few factors. For instance, the frequency with which a child experienced these forbidding gestures, or consistency of punishing events. For example, if you used a negative word at home and your parent blew up at you in some cases when you used it, and then seemed to not have cared as much in other cases, this indicates to the child that something is wrong with them and not with the using the specific word. So the punishment was inconsistent. Another factor is failure to differentiate between behavior and identity. So for example, if a parent labels the child as lazy if they don't do their homework once, instead of pointing out that the behavior is negative, the child will adopt this identity of being lazy. Why do we listen to this inner critic? Contrary to the popular opinion, it's rewarding to listen to it. He helps you meet basic needs, and listening to this vicious voice can actually be reinforcing. But wait, how can so much pain be reinforcing? When you have high self-esteem, you solve problems instead of worrying about them. You find ways to make people respond to you positively. You cope with the conflict directly rather than wait for it to pass. When you have low self-esteem, you don't feel as able to cope with anxiety, interpersonal problems, challenging risks. You just don't feel effective. People with low self-esteem refer to the critic to help them cope with feelings of anxiety, helplessness, inadequacy. While the critic is beating you up, he's also making you feel better. For example, if you have a challenging task that you need to complete at work, instead of attacking it head on, you might create an impossible standard for yourself of how it should be completed. And since you are unable to achieve this impossible standard, You procrastinate and beat yourself up for not managing to deliver on par with your own standards. It's hard to grasp it, but every time critic pipes you up, you just feel a little less anxious, less incompetent. It's almost as if you're so afraid of being criticized and punished by others that you take the lead and do it yourself to minimize the pain of surprise from rejection and criticism from others. Let's elaborate. So, how does the inner critic help us feel right? So, to start with, it compares us with others and sets unrealistic and perfectionistic standards. The critic continuously evaluates how you stack up in terms of intelligence, achievements, sexual attractiveness, looks, likability, social competence, anything that you value. Many times you feel like you're less adequate compared to others, but once in a while you decide that you're more attractive, smarter, warmer, and this is the moment that you feel satisfaction. Similar to a gambler who gets an occasional win at the slots. These times when you feel better about yourself compared to others make you keep coming back to the inner critic for more. Setting incredibly high standards for yourself and on how you, for example, perform at work. Most of the time you may lose, but once in a while the stars line up and you deliver perfectly on par with your standards and you get the occasional glimpse of satisfaction. The inner critic also helps you feel accepted by your critical parents. And this is actually the most painful thing because it joins your parents in attacking you. And if your parents labeled you as fat or failure when you were a kid, your critic will join them by calling you the same names. Every time you use a critical self statement that agrees with your parents, you feel just a little closer to them, paradoxically feeling more accepted, more loved. You're seeing things their way and enjoying them, you experience a sense of belonging, emotional security, and it strongly reinforces your inner voice. Finally, the inner critic helps you feel right by helping you achieve goals. It's whipping you like an old horse. He drives you viciously and attacks on your worth. If you don't make 3 sales this week, that means you're lazy, you're incompetent, you're a lousy breadwinner. What reinforces the critic is that you do occasionally achieve things based just because you were driven by the critic to do certain things and you were pushed by him. So you continue using the inner critic to help you get this occasional win. Now that we somewhat understand how this vicious voice operates, let's try to take a stab in taming this destructive, toxic entity that lives in your head rent free. So, step one is catching your critic. To gain control of your inner critic, you first need to be able to hear him. Every single moment of your life, you're engaging in an inner monologue. You're interpreting experiences, problem solving, speculating. Catching the critic in the act of putting you down requires a special vigilance. You have to notice the critic when he says, stupid, another dumb mistake, you're weak, you'll never get the job done. Then it will hit you with some images of your past mistakes and failures. This will just reinforce that you are a failure. So here's an exercise. Monitor your critic. For one day, stay as vigilant as possible for self-attacks. Count the number of critical statements that you make to yourself. You may be surprised how frequently your internal monologue turns to negative self-appraisal. Next step, write them down. Take a piece of paper, draw a line in the middle. On one side, write down all of the negative statements that you make about yourself. And then on the other side, write down their function. For example, I am saying this to avoid feeling this. For instance, I am rejecting myself to avoid feeling pain from being rejected by others. As you go down the list, you will realize that the critic attacks were reinforced because it drives you to higher levels of achievement. It's trying to protect you, or it's driving you to self-improvement. And on rare occasions, when you meet these high standards, you kind of feel self-acceptance. Every time a critic attacks, he's doing you a real psychological harm. He's further wounding your sense of worth and making it harder for you to feel competent and happy in the world. You just cannot afford what he's doing to you. It's just costing you too much. So step two is disarming the critic. So this step involves actually three steps in itself. One, unmasking his purpose. Two, talking back. And three, making him useless, unmasking his purpose. Getting clear on the critic's function makes everything he says less believable. So when you're exposed to his ulterior motive, no matter what he says, you just feel less vulnerable. So, for example, you are criticizing me so I can perform better and may feel better about myself. This is one of the ways you can unmask his purpose. Essentially, this is kind of an extension of the first exercise of catching the inner critic. Number two, talking back to your critic. This may sound odd, but talking back to your critic is an effort to refute the negative programming that was implanted in you when you were a kid. You start by asking the price. What is the price of this negative self-talk? For instance, you're not assertive during your client meeting because you're afraid of rejection. This may be costing you $10,000 a month. So you are actually putting a price on what this pathological critic is doing to you. Or you're cold and distant from your coworkers because you're kind of afraid of rejection. You don't feel worthy of their companionship. And this is costing you improved working environments, potential promotion opportunities, feeling psychologically safe at the workplace. Literally, make a list of ways that your inner critic is costing, what your inner critic is costing you, and you can even put a dollar amount to it to see the damage. Finally, is affirming your worth. It's not enough to identify, talk back, evaluate the damage. You need to replace this negative voice with a positive one, with one that is laced with truth and self-worth. Most importantly, you need to believe in the affirmation that you will be replacing this negative self-talk with, because if you don't believe it, this will be just another affirmation that is worthless. So you need to do the work. So how can we transform this negative self-talk into affirmations that we actually believe in and that actually create a safer environment for our life? Remember, this pathological critic is trying to make us do the right thing, feel the right thing, and it makes us achieve things. So if we go step by step, instead of letting the critic coerce you into rigid, outdated standards, first you need to reevaluate the rules that you live by. Align your expectations with your present reality, focusing on what truly supports your happiness and well-being now. So for example, if you think about it, sometimes the negative self-talk will tell you you need to lose 10 pounds or 20 pounds to match how you looked when you were 15 years old, for instance. But you are now, say, 30 years old, and these are just unrealistic expectations. You don't even need to look the way you did when you were 15, but you have this outdated standards. So what you need to do is to revise them and to make sure that they are matching the current reality that is healthy for you. So the inner critic is trying to tie your self-worth to your achievements. And this is how he gets you down. So what you need to do is shift your from using self-criticism for motivation to cultivating self-compassion and intrinsic goals, recognizing that your worth is inherent and it's not tied to any of your achievements. This transformation allows you to meet your needs while silencing the inner critic's harmful influence, fostering a more supportive and empowering mindset. This is a very good start in challenging your old beliefs and building a healthier, more supportive strategy for living, doing, and achieving with ease and flow. Want to learn more? In my next video, we'll be talking about building self-esteem as a next step. Thank you.